All right, I will say good morning, a good mayid. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. I'm sorry that we're getting started a few moments late. Begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Jerry and Sarah Walansky, for dedicating all the Shur and Drushos this month. In the schus of Refuah Shlema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira, Shani and Avram Kelman in memory of their beloved parents, and the schus of all those who need Refuah Shlema. Dr. Linda Weinberg in loving memory of her husband Peretz Moshe Ben Avram David. Leah Sol is a schus for Refuah Shlema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther. Our week of learning sponsors: Ira Grossman, in creation of the 12th yard site of his father Melech Ben Azriel, and Valerie Asapov as a schus for Refuah Shlema for Irina Bas Brilliant. We hope them the merit of our Talmud Torah. All of those who require Refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and all of the Neshama should have an Aliyah and the families in Nechama. But so with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Nun Beis 52, and we are picking up Emir Hashem on Nun Aleph Amud Beis, right? Tashma, right? Good, excellent. 5 lines up from the bottom. Good, Tashma. The other one? Okay. All right, so the other Tashma, so good. I got a little excited over there. All right, it almost sounds like a normal Daf Yomi shir. It's incredible. So that we are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say Tashma. So if you remember again, we are in the midst of a fundamental machlokes between Abaye and Rava regarding the topic of Kiddushin she'enon misurin libiyah. What happens if you have a marriage that can't result in biyah? What does it mean it can't result in biyah? That ultimately, again, the biyah would be aser. So is such a Kiddushin valid or not? So remember again, Abaye says it is proper Kiddushin, or in other words, it's an effective Kiddushin, and Rava says it's not. So that's the conversation. So I kind of spilled the beans a little bit yesterday by highlighting the fact that we paskin like Abaye, that even Kiddushin she'enon misur libiyah is considered to be a Kiddushin. Granted, it's not a sustainable marriage because one is going to have to dissolve such a union, but Lamaisa, technically speaking, the Kiddushin works. Of course, now the Gemara is still in the midst of all of this machlokes. So Tashma. So what's the interesting case here? A man goes ahead and was Mekadesh, one of 2 sisters. Ve'ena Yodea Ezo Kiddush. But he doesn't know which one. You see, if you were to have that beer at Daf Yomi, that's what happens, right? That's what happens. So what happens? He doesn't know which sister is Mekadesh. So what's the halacha? No saying get lazu u get lazu. So you have to get to both. Okay, so remember again, because it's Safek Mekudeshes, we don't know who potentially is married to who, so you have to give a get to each one. So we'll say, so again, what do you see from here? But the point is, again, what do you see from here? Now this is obviously a case of Kiddushin she'enon misur libiyah, because he can't have relations with either of these women, because it's possible that what? Either one of them is the sister of his wife, but yet you see they both require a get. That shows you that the Kiddushin was valid. Therefore, Allah Lamaisa, this is a proof to Abaye, Akash and Rava. Gemara says, no, what's the case here? Never say the case over here is, at the time of the Kiddushin, he knew which sister was Mekadesh. Afterwards, whatever the circumstances were, that's where the confusion set in. But at the moment of Kiddushin, there was absolute clarity. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, we're not talking about with the Kiddushin itself is absolutely valid. Dekanami diktani, Eino Yodea. You can also see this because it says Eino Yodea, he doesn't know now which sister it was. The Eino Katani, Eino Yadua. So we'll say, had it said Eino Yadua means it was never known. Eino Yodea means he does not know the distinction. Eino Yodea means he doesn't know now, but at the time of Kiddushin he did know. Eino Yadua means it was never known. If that's the case, Ma'ila Memra. So I'll say, if that's the case, then what's the Chiddush over in this case? So this actually seems to be a pretty straightforward case. I mean, not straightforward, but you know, understand halachically straightforward, which is a man is Mekadesh, one of 2 sisters. At the time of Kiddush, he knows exactly which sister is Mekadesh. Then afterwards, for whatever reason, he gets confused. They're confused, he's confused, everyone's confused. So what's the halacha? He gives a get to each one. We'll say it's a pretty straightforward case. So what's the Chiddush? Sefer Tzrichalei. Ultimately, again, you need the sefer. We'll say, what's the sefer? Meis velo ech achas. Velo ach echar. So we'll say the sefer is actually the case that we need. What happens if this guy, we'll just call him Ruvain. Ruvain died before giving a get to both of these women, and Ruvain has a surviving brother. What's the halacha? Cholitz l'shtein. So the surviving brother will call him Shimon, has to do chalitza with both of these women. Makes sense. Hayulo shnayim. What happens if he had two brothers? Echad cholitz ve'echad miyabim. One brother could do chalitza, the other brother could do yibum. Im kidmu v'kinso in motzin osam miyadam. But ultimately, again, if we went ahead and married her, we would not go ahead and cause him to divorce her. So the Gemara says, Dafka, Michlatz, V'hadr Yivumi. But the ideal order over here is first Chalitza has to be done, and then Yibum, Aval Yivumi, V'hadr Michlatz, but doing Yibum first, and then Chalitza, Lo, de Kapaga Ba'achos Zikukas. You can't do Yibum for Chalitza. Why? Because any surviving brother that would potentially do Yibum first, potentially, and both say, is having relations with the sister of his Zekuka, right? The sister of the woman with whom he's obligated to do Yibum, which of course is problematic. Okay, so that's the novelty in the case. Tashma, Shnaim Shekitchu Shtei Achayos. Two brothers, right? Reuven and Shimon were Mekadesh, two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Ze eni yodea is a kiddush, ze eni yodea is a kiddush. So neither brother is clear on which girl, on which woman he was Mekadesh. So what's the halacha? Zed no sein shnei gittin, v'zed no sein shnei gittin. So we'll say each brother gives two gittin. They will say again. So what does this prove? This proves kiddushin she'inan mesurin labiyah is kiddushin. Because the Kiddushin itself worked. V'haraya, in order to dissolve it, you require a get. Support to Abaye, kasha on Rava. To which the Gemara says, no, same thing we said before. This case actually is where Reuven and Shimon at the time of Kiddushin were actually explicitly clear on which girl each one was being Mekadesh. The confusion set in later on. If the Gemara says, "Dekenami, diktani eina yodea velo katani eina yadua shmamina," and also you can see it in the lashon over here because it says eina yodea. He doesn't know now, meaning he knew beforehand, but he doesn't know now. It doesn't say eina yadua; it wasn't known at all. Shmamina, good. To which the Gemara says, so we'll say if that's the case, we're just talking about a case: two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, being Mekadesh, two sisters, Rachel and Leah. At the time of Kiddushin, Reuven knew who he was being Mekadesh. Shimon knew who he was being Mekadesh. What happened? Confusion set in later on. What's the halacha? Reuven gives a get to both women. Shimon gives a get to both women. Straightforward case. Straightforward case. To which so I understand what's the Chiddush over here. Seifa. No, you need the Seifa. I'll say, what's the Seifa? Here we go. Mace. What happens if the brothers die? And I'll say, here we go. Mace, v'laze'ach. So what happens? Ultimately, again, and I'll say, no, I made a mistake. This is not a case of two brothers, right? This is a case of Shnayim, two men. Two men, I'm sorry. Right? So in other words, Reuven and Shimon are not brothers, but ultimately, again, they are both being Mekadesh sisters. I'm sorry. So now watch this. Now, Reuven died. Mace, v'laze'ach. Right? So Reuven died and Shimon died. Both leave behind surviving brothers. Ultimately, again, each of the surviving brothers does chalitza with Rachel and Leah. Okay, but here's where it gets good, right? So what happens if one brother, let's say Reuven leaves behind one brother, Shimon leaves behind two brothers, top of nun days. So one of the brothers does chalitza with both of the women, Rachel and Leah. The remaining two brothers, the other surviving two brothers, one does chalitza, and at that point the other one has the ability to do yibum should he choose. Im kidmu v'kinsu, if the brother did yibum before chalitza, eid motzin osam miyadam. Ultimately, again, we don't cause them to divorce their wives. V'dafka, but ideally, michlatz v'hadr yivumi. Chalitza does have to happen before yibum. Aval yivumi v'hadr michlatz lo. But I will say doing yibum first, ultimately, and then doing chalitza will not work. Why? Dikapaga b'yavama l'shuk. Ultimately, again, because it could turn out that he has having relations with a woman who really is eligible for yibum. Good. So we'll say for our purposes, what do we take from this? For our purposes is that halacha l'maisa, our machlokes Abaye and Rava is still here. Right? We brought down these cases ultimately as a support to Abaye that kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah is proper kiddushin, right? Is an effective kiddushin, and it turns out that these cases can't be a proof to that because these cases aren't talking about any type of kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah. Good. So therefore, again, our machlokes is still there. Tashma. Let's go back there. The Tani Yomi, lazeh chamisha banim, lazeh chamisha banim, lazeh chamisha banim. So also listen to this interesting case. Reuven has 5 sons. Shimon has 5 daughters. V'amar, achaz mibnosech mikudeshas la'achad mibanai. I will say what happens. The parents, the fathers, they make a shidduch. They make a shidduch. One of your daughters should become mekudeshes to one of my sons. They will say only one little detail, which is they didn't specify who. Right? They didn't specify in the excitement of the shidduch. One little detail we forgot to specify the chassan and the kala. So what's the halacha? Kol achas va'achas tzricha chamisha gittin. So now what we have over here is a safek kiddushin that devolves upon all of these girls. So therefore each of the daughters requires 5 gittin, in other words a get, from each of the sons in order to avoid any suspicion or any possibility of kiddushin. Even before we go on, by the way, so again, you see, what is this a case of? So this is a case of Kiddushin Sheina Mesur Labiyah, right? Because Lamaisa, again, none of the sons could have relations with any of the daughters. Why? Because Lamaisa, there'd be the possibility that it's the sister of his wife. Yet, ultimately, we are acquiring a get, which indicates to us that a Kiddushin Sheina Mesur Labiyah is still considered to be a valid Kiddushin. Meis Echad Mehem, if one of the sons died, then all of the girls will require 4 gittin, obviously because one brother has now passed away, and chalitza, right? 4 gittin and chalitza from one of the brothers. So once again, the whole point of this is this is a case of kiddushin, even without delving into all the complexities. Once you're requiring a get, we'll say, what does that mean? Once you're requiring a get, what does that tell you? That there's a kiddushin, or at least a safek kiddushin. All of these cases are kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah. You're never allowed to have relations with these women because there's always the possibility that the woman you're having relations with is not the woman you're married to, but rather is the sister of the woman you're married to, which of course is asur. The fact that we require indicates that kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah is kiddushin. Support to Abaye kashan Rava. Similar, it's like we said before. Maybe the case over here, I want to say once again, is a case where at the time of kiddushin, it was clear, so there was a valid kiddushin, and the ambiguity or the doubt set in afterwards, to which the Gemara says, that can't be, I'll tell you why. Ha'achas bibinoseich le'echa mibonai katani. I'll say, because even the way this case is framed, right, the lashon of the fathers is, one of your daughters will marry one of my sons. So I will say there's ambiguity baked into the case itself. So this is clearly a case of kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah, yet there's the requirement of a get, which indicates to us that the kiddushin is valid, which the Gemara says, tiyufta de Rava tiyufta. We have effectively refuted the position of Rava. Remember again, Rava holds kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah lo havu kiddushin, that if you have a kiddushin that can't result in biyah, the kiddushin is ineffective. Clearly from this case, you see that is false. That is incorrect. V'hilchasa kavase da'abaye biyal kigam. There was saying normally in a machlokes Abaye and Rava, the halacha follows Rava. The exception is 6 cases where the halacha always follows Abaye. Rashi points out over here, Yal Kigam, Simani halacha saying Shenechalaku Bahana Abaye Rav, Chol Makam halacha Karava. Normally machlokes Abaye and Rav halacha like Rav, like we just said before, Chutz Me'elu. Except with these cases, we'll say what are the cases? So Yud is Yeyosh Shalomidas, which is right. Again, we're not going to go through all of these cases right now, but Yeyosh Shalomidas is a case of where the owner despairs. Yeyosh Shalomidas is the owner doesn't know yet about the fact that he lost something. So can you have yeyosh? Can you despair of retrieving an item if you're not aware that it has been lost? That's yeyosh shalomidas. Okay, we're not going to go through all of them. I'll say, but the point over here is the mem is kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah. No, that is incorrect. No, the kuf, sorry. The kuf is kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah. So we'll say, so that's the kuf of Yal Kigam. We pass like Abaye over here, so we'll say very important halacha. So therefore, again, I ruined it a little bit yesterday already. But halacha l'maisa, we pass like Abaye, kiddushin she'enan mesurin labiyah. Ultimately, again, is still a valid kiddushin. Obviously, I will say once again, it's an unsustainable kiddushin, right? We're going to mandate a get in that particular scenario, but it works nevertheless. Incredible. Let's go back there. So remember again, back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah then had the interesting case. Remember, the Mishnah had the interesting case of a guy. Remember the situation? The guy walked into a field. He went over to a group of women, right? He had a basket of dates. The dates, right, in the field belonged to the women, or one of the women there. He took dates, right? It was Shemitah, so therefore the dates were Hefker, and he was Mekadesh all of them. Remember again, the reason why this got messy, well, this is messy on a variety of levels, right? But Lamaisa, for our purposes, because there were two sisters in that group. Two sisters in that group. So the Gemara says as follows, Maisa b'chamish nashim, Amarav, so Rav says, Shema minom mesnisin, Arba. Both say there are four lessons, four takeaways from our Mishnah. V'nokit Rav biadei tlos. But Rav went ahead and accepted Theodor's. Let me just read it to you once more. The case was Maisa b'chamish nashim, 5 women, ubahen shtei achayos, 2 sisters in the group. V'liket adam echad kalkala shel te'enim. Right, a man collected a basket of dates. V'shelahen haisa. The dates belonged to the women, or at least one of the women in the group. She was on the field. V'shal shviyas haisa. It was a Shemitah year. V'amar, and he said to them, Hare kulchem mikudesh asibe kalkala zu. All of you are mikudesh with this basket. The kibla achas min adei kulan. One of the women accepted the basket of dates on behalf of the group. The Chacham said, Ein achayos mikudashos. Right? Ultimately, the sisters are not mikudashos. That's the case. And now says the Gemara, says Rav, there are 4 lessons, 4 takeaways from this case. Rav only subscribed to 3 of them. Here we go, Bosai. Shema mina. What do we learn? Shema mina, hamakadesh shapero shvias mikudeshas. Number 1, lesson number 1. If you are mekadesh a woman with shmita produce, she's mikudeshas. Right? So we'll say this is very important. Now again, remember, shmita produce is hefker. Is hefker. So takeaway number 1 is if you acquire shmita produce, you could use that to betroth a woman. Number 2, shmamina. If you go ahead and you betroth a woman with stolen property, ultimately, again, she's not mikudeshes. And I will say now, where does the Gemara get that from? Because remember, again, the Mishnah went out of its way to say that it was Shemitah, right? Why did it go out of its way to say that it's Shemitah? To go ahead and tell me that Allah, if it wasn't Shemitah, remember again, I will say, who did the field belong to? Who did the field belong to? One of the women. So again, remember, so the reason why the Kiddushin worked was because it was Shemitah produce, it was Hefker. He was able to acquire to use it for Kiddushin. But you see from here, had he taken produce from that field that did not belong to him, that would have been theft, that would have been gezel, and you can't be Mekadesh woman with gezel, with theft. Afilu begezel dida. Now listen, here's something interesting. Even if the stolen property belongs to the woman you are betrothing. I was about to say, so that sounds a little bit strange. I'll tell you why this is interesting. See, the Gemara suggests like this. If Reuven were to go over to Rachel, steal an object from her, right? Just take it from her, and then give it back to her, right? Ba'idam zu, whatever it is, and she accepts it. I would say, the way we can think about this is, listen, maybe what she's doing is, she's essentially conveying ownership over the item to him so that he could go ahead and utilize it for Kiddushin. That's the Havamina. That's the Havamina. So the Gemara says you see from here that you cannot affect Kiddushin with stolen property, even if it's her stolen property. Mimayr, say, where do we see this from? Because the Mishnah said, Mediktani, Shalahem Haisa, because even though, again, the field belonged to some of the women in the group, the Haisa Vishal Shvias Haisa, but it was Shemitah. Time of the Shvias, the Hefkerhu. The reason why he was able to affect Kiddushin with those dates was why? Because it was Shemitah and the produce was Hefker. Haj Deshar Shnei Shavua Lo. But it was, had it been another year, i.e. not a Shemitah year, it wouldn't have worked. Why? Because it was stolen produce. And so you cannot go ahead and affect Kiddushin with stolen produce. We'll say, if you look at Rashi, so Rashi says, Va'afilu gezel dida, v'lo amrinon midekablise achilte. Again, I will say, one would have thought that if she is receiving her own stolen property, maybe she was mochelas, right? She kind of forgave the stuff that was stolen. The husband acquired it, and she affected Kiddushin like that. Fine. So we'll say that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3. Shmamina, isha nasa shliach lechaverta, afilu b'makom shenasis latzara. What's a very interesting case? A woman could be a shaliach to accept Kiddushin on behalf of another woman, even if that second woman becomes her co-wife. Right? I was about to say, so, because remember, what's the case? The case is the man in question, Reuven, is being mekadesh a group of 5 women. One of the women went ahead and accepted the Kiddushin on behalf of the group. Remember, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said it's just the sisters are excluded, but apparently the Kiddushin worked for the rest of the group. So you see that one woman was accepting the Kiddushin on behalf of the collective, on behalf of the group. And you could do that ultimately, even though one of them becomes a tzara. Now, both say, now what's the novelty in that? The novelty in that is that, remember, Rashi points out over Rashi says, I will say, remember, generally, co-wives they're certainly not permitted to give testimony, right, for each other, right? Because there's understood to be like an inherent animosity and tension. Even though that is true, one co-wife could act as a shaliach for another co-wife. Good. So I will say, so these are the three takeaways from the Mishnah. Number one, if you're mekadesh a woman with Shemitah produce, it is effective. Number two, if you're mekadesh a woman ultimately, again, with stolen property, even her own stolen property, it is not effective. And number three, one woman could act as a shaliach to go ahead and accept Kiddushin on behalf of other women, even though those other women subsequently what? Become her co-wife, become her tzara. Incredible. So we'll say, so now remember again, the way this Gemara started was Rav said, there are 4 takeaways from the Mishnah. Rava accepted 3. Sorry. So right, there are right, 4 takeaways from the Mishnah. 4 takeaways from the Mishnah yet. And Rav took 3. So I will say, the Gemara says, so nu, what's the 4th? V'idach mahi. What's the 4th one? Kiddushin she'en misrun l'biyah. V'kiddushin she'en misrun l'biyah. So we'll say, the third lesson was regarding Kiddushin she'ein mesurin l'biyah. Says the Gemara. So why not go ahead v'nechshavei? Why not include that one as well? Mishum de'misavkalei ika abayi ika Rava. All right, I will say, so Rav didn't really want to wade into that machlokes, right? Since Kiddushin she'ein mesurin l'biyah, it's machlokes Abayi and Rav, so Abayi and Rava. So Rav didn't want to wade into that. He only took the 3 takeaways that are agreed upon by everyone. Incredible. Ki salik Rabbi Zera. So what is this? Rabbi Zera came along. Ki salik Rabbi Zera. Amr lahashmaita kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Zera came along and he said over this teaching, this ruling in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Amr le, mi Amr Rav Hachi. Did Rav really say this? Rashi says over here, Amr Rav Hachi, kasak adaitcha atmui atman b'shum delo svira le. So the Gemara says, mi Amr Rav Hachi, v'hu lo Amr. And he did not say this. V'amr Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Gazal, v'lo nesyashu abaylim. We'll say, if an object was stolen, but the owners did not yet have yeyosh. Remember again, yeyosh is when you give up, right? You despair of retrieving the item. Once there is yeyosh, essentially again you relinquish ownership over the object. So what happens if you have a stolen object, but the owners did not have yeyosh? What's the halacha? Shnehem einam yecholin lahakdish. So I will say, the case over is as follows. Imagine for a moment. Ruvain stole an object from Shimon. Okay? Shimon, so now Ruvain has a stolen object. Shimon has not yet experienced the Yeyosh. He hasn't given up hope of retrieving the item. So the Gemara says, neither of them have the ability to be makdish, to consecrate the item. Ruvain can't consecrate it. Why? Because it doesn't belong to him. Right? Shimon can't consecrate it. Why? Because he doesn't have it in his domain. So the Gemara says, Haki Kamarle. So we'll say, so ultimately Rabbi Yochanan was saying, Mi Amar Rav Kavasi. Rabbi Yochanan was just remarking that Rav ultimately again held like him. Okay, good. So the Gemara says as follows. And I will say the idea over here that Rabbi Yochanan was highlighting was that Rav hold. Remember, what does Rav hold? Rav holds you can't be mekadesh with stolen property. And I will say, why can't you be mekadesh with stolen property? Why not? Because it's not in your domain, it's not yours. So Rabbi Yochanan was, at first he thought Rabbi Yochanan was challenging Rav. Now it turns out he's not challenging Rav, he's actually agreeing with Rav, or he was amazed that Rav agreed with him. Because why? What does Rabbi Yochanan hold? Rabbi Yochanan holds that if Ruvain steals property from Shimon, and Shimon hasn't had yeyosh, I shouldn't say property, an object, so ultimately again, Ruvain can't consecrate it. Why? It's not in his domain. Shimon can't consecrate, Ruvain can't consecrate it. Why? It doesn't belong to him. Shimon can't consecrate it because it's not in his domain. But the point over here is what? You can't go ahead and do something with something that doesn't belong to you. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rav are essentially saying the same thing, just illustrating the same principle in 2 different ways. If something doesn't belong to you, you cannot affect transactional reality with it. Rav is demonstrating that by showing you can't use stolen property to affect Kiddushin. Rabbi Yochanan is showing that you can't use stolen property or you can't make stolen property hekdesh. Okay, incredible. To which the Gemara says, if a man, Ruvain, is Mekadesh Rachel with Gezel, Chamas, and Geneva. Supposed to remember again, Gezel, Chamas, and Geneva are all different types of theft, right? So Gezel is when you just steal something in front of someone, plain sight, right? Geneva is when you steal something, what's the word? Surreptitiously, right? You steal it secretly. Chamas is when you take something by force, but you pay for it. In other words, it's like I take something, but I leave the money here. So I'll say, so now, these are all cases of theft. So now watch this. So Ruvain was Mekadesh Rachel with a stolen item, right? Whatever type, Gezel, Chamas, theft. O Shechataf Selam Yada, Vikitsha. Or about to listen to this case. Ruvain walks over to Rachel, takes a selah from her hand, right? Literally takes a selah from her hand, and then gives it back to her for Kiddushin. All of these cases, Nikudeshas. So I will say, so obviously this is a big kasha. And I will say, obviously, just to point out, in the case where he's stealing a selah from her and giving it back to her, obviously she's accepting it, right? In other words, you can't be mekadesh woman against her will. The only case like that maybe exists is the father with his kitana daughter. But other than that, of course, Kiddushin requires consent. The point that I will say is, what do you see from here? That Allah, so you can't be mekadesh woman with stolen property. So that contradicts what we just said before. So what's going on over here? This is fascinating. To which the Gemara says, Hasam begezel dida. So I'll say the case that we're talking about is all of these items are stolen from her. He's being mekadesh with property stolen from her. So what is it? Take a look at the last Rashi. Kevan de kabli say achilte. So I'll say, listen to this. I mentioned this before. You see, when Reuven steals something from Rachel and then gives it back to her to effect Kiddushin, and she accepts it, b'toras Kiddushin, essentially what has happened over here? What's happened? She essentially has been mochelas. She's been mochel. Right? She forgives that. In other words, fine, he's taking it. She essentially conveys ownership. She forgives it. She conveys ownership to him over the object. And therefore, it turns out that when he's being mekadesh her, he's being mekadesh her with something that he himself owns. Fascinating. Gezel dida. To which the Gemara says, well, 1 second. I'm sorry. Hasam begezel dida. I hamid diktani safe. But look at the end of that price where it says, Oshechataf. Sela Mishela. Well, so here's the problem. The Seifa explicitly says, or if he takes something from her. So if the Seifa is talking about property stolen or an object stolen from her, the Pashtos the Reisha is not. Mechlal the Reisha Gezel the Alma Askinon. Sounds like the Reisha is talking about just stam theft, not from her, and yet the Reisha is saying you can't be Mechadish woman with stolen property. To which the Gemara says, Pirushay Kamefarish. Really, ultimately, again, the Sefer is coming to explain the Reisha. If a man was mekadesh woman with stolen property, and that's the Reisha, and then Sefer Keitzad Kigon Shechatav Sela Miyadav Kitshaba. As an example, he stole property from her, right? Sela, a coin from her, and then gave it back to her. To which the Gemara says the Kitshaba. Ultimately, again, it'll work. So I'll say, the Gemara is introducing us to the concept maybe of gezel dida. So maybe if you steal something from the woman herself, and then go ahead and use that for Kiddushin, halacha l'mais it'll work. Why? Because there's an implied mechila. It's even more than an implied mechila. Since she's accepting it back, ultimately for Kiddushin, then halacha l'mais it'll work. The Gemara says, 1 second. V'hamas nisin de gezel dida. Now let's go back to our Mishnah. We'll say our Mishnah was a case of where the property in question is being stolen from her. Right? Look at Rashi. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Right? In our Mishnah, Reuven was walking into the field, collected a basket of dates, and gave it to this group of women, ultimately to effect Kiddushin. Now, remember again, the reason the Mishnah said the Kiddushin worked was why? How did the Mishnah set it up? It was Shvius, it was Shemitah. So if you hold that halacha l'maisa, you could actually affect Kiddushin with stolen property that belongs to the woman herself. Why do they need to set it up as a Shemitah case? Just let it be a regular case. Right? Rav said the only reason why the Kiddushin worked was because it was a Shemitah year, a Shemitah produce. The inference from that was, had it been stolen produce, it wouldn't have worked. To which the Gemara says, Lo Kashya, had shadich, had lo shadich. Shabbos is actually very interesting. The Gemara says, no. When do we say that if a man is mekadesh with stolen property, that ultimately, again, the Kiddushin works? that's when they had already spoken about marriage beforehand. Oh, this makes a lot more sense. So in other words, if you have Reuven and Rachel, and they already spoke about marriage, right? They agreed to get married. And then Reuven comes and takes property from Rachel and uses that to Mekadesh her. All right, that makes sense. That's when the Kiddushin works. Why? Because since they're already in the parasha, they spoke about marriage already. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, that's where the mechila, that's where the forgiveness, so to speak, comes in. But in a case where it's kind of like, a cold call over here, right? They're just walking in, there's no previous discussion of marriage, then halacha l'maisa, you can't be mekadesh with stolen property. So really, it's an interesting yesod that you could steal something from someone with whom you have a previous relationship, and yet, again, that person automatically forgives the mechila, or forgives the theft in order to further the relationship. Right? I would say, if you think about it, it's an overwhelmingly beautiful metaphor for our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. Because what happens between us and Hashem, the Ribono Shel Olam gives us kohos, He gives us abilities, and He gives us brachas. And I will say, what happens in life? So, intentionally, unintentionally, we steal from the Ribono Shel Olam. How do I steal from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because the Ribono Shel Olam gives me my kohos, and He gives me my brachos in order to accomplish good things. But sometimes what ends up happening is, I go ahead and I steal it from Hashem, and I use those kohos, and I use those brachos. Unfortunately, again, for chet, for aveira, I misappropriate that which has been given to me. But yet, when I do tshuva, and I recommit myself ultimately again to going ahead and using those kochos and using those brachos for something good, I'm able to go ahead and then reinvigorate the relationship. The same way that when Reuven, why I will say, why is that? Why is tshuva possible? The shadich. Because I have a shidduch with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You see, when you're in the context of a relationship, so once there's a relationship, an established relationship could weather relationship trespass. Right? When there is an established relationship, that's when, even if one of the parties acts out, because there's a framework of relationship, it's a forgivable offense. We could work this through. When there's no relationship, so any trespass, by definition, prevents the relationship from even occurring. I have a relationship with Hashem. There's shidduchim, right? There's a shidduch between me and the Ribono Shel Olam. And that way, when there is theft, ultimately, again, the relationship is strong enough to ultimately allow for mechila. The Ribono Shel Olam, so to speak, is able to allow for mechila of the theft. Why? Because the Maisa, there's a shidduch. Such an incredible yisod. Hayi Isisa, both say Nun Beis 52b, 3 lines down. Hayi Isisa. Interesting case here. The Kamasha Kara b'mishkala demaya. There was a woman who was washing her feet in a bowl. Mishkala demayim is like a wash basin. And I will say, the truth is, that detail has nothing to do with the story, right? It just happens to be that they say this is a story that happened. So Gemara is just telling us the story that happened. Story that happened. Yeah. Okay. I won't say it. It's interesting. I'll say also, what's fascinating is, like sometimes you're having a conversation with someone, and they're telling you like a story, and they're not leaving out one detail. And you're like, get to it. Get to it. I know there's a point in here somewhere. Get to it. And sometimes you actually make the mistake of saying that. And especially if it happens to be the person you're married to and you say that, right? And I will say, it is the most, it's interesting, right? It's the most offensive thing in the world. The most offensive thing in the world. You're like, is there a point here? Is this like story time? What is it you're conveying? So I will say, remember, there's a mussar in everything. There's a mussar in everything. And I think what Chazal are also teaching us, Rabbi Osai, is that sometimes what it means to be in a relationship is to listen. And even if you don't see any point in the information being conveyed, and even if you're wondering, where is this going? Like, what is this doing? I will say, sometimes when you're involved in something, you just sit and you listen. I think because otherwise, why does the Gemara, you're going to see this piece of information has nothing to do with the story. The lady was washing her feet in a wash basin. Okay. Sometimes, I will say, you just have to be present, and you just have to be willing to listen in the context of what's occurring. So what happens? Also, Gavra, Chatav Zuzim Michavre. So we'll say what happens. Okay, so we'll call it Rachel. Rachel is washing her feet, right? Reuven comes along, and he takes a zuz from his friend, Vishadala, and he gives it to Rachel. Amrla, Mikad become Mikudeshes to me with this zuz. So Reuven is Mekadesh Rachel with stolen money. Okay, so I'll say, so now what happened? Also, Gavra Kamei Rabba. So now I'll say, what's the Shaila? Is the Kiddushin valid or not? So also, Gavra Kamei Rabba. So the guy came before Rabba, right? Amar, les dechash le de Rabbi Shimon, damar stam gizeli yeyosh bailam habi. And Rabba said, no one holds of the position of Rabbi Shimon. Rabba says, it's actually very interesting. Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, stam gezel is yerush bailam. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that the overwhelming majority of people, when an item is stolen, they have immediate yerush. And I will say that would actually work well in this situation. Why? Because then when Reuven took the zuz from Shimon, there's assumed yerush. And I will say once there's yerush, who owns the zuz? Reuven, and therefore there's Mekadesh Rachel with the zuz, and it's an effective Kiddushin. So Rava essentially said to Reuven, no one holds that way, and therefore you're Mekadesh with stolen property, and being Mekadesh with stolen property does not work. Doesn't work. Fine. What's another story? Good stories here. Who are resay the Kaddish bemuza the shamchi. There was an aris. Now we'll say an aris is a sharecropper. Now remember again, we'll say what's a typical sharecropping arrangement. We'll say is you get a percentage of the field. Now we'll say the way that works is at the end of the harvest season, everything is divided up. So you have a sharecropper over here who took a handful of onions, right, and gave it to a woman. Hariat nikudeshes li ba'anyin zu, right? So he gives her a handful of onions. He came before Rava. Amarli man achloch. So we'll say, so Rava said to the sharecropper, it's not yours. It's not yours. In other words, that's not the way sharecropping works. In other words, take a look at Rashi. Man achlach mi machalacha chelko shabal abayis. In other words, who is mochel to you, right? Who allowed you to take a portion that wasn't given to you? V'hani mili b'muza. And also the reason it's problematic is because he took a handful. Aval kisha, but had he given, we'll say kisha is like a bundle. Rashi says aguda. A bundle. A bundle, right? Shabbos now, Kisha, Matzi Amar, the sharecropper could have said, Ana Shakli Kisha, right? Ana Shakli Kisha, Shakil at Kisha, Kisha ki Kisha. But here's what's interesting. The problem with what the sharecropper did was not that he gave her vegetables, it's the amount. You see, the way a sharecropper works, we'll say he's going to get a standardized amount. How do you normally go ahead and divide up onions? By the bundle, right? It's not like one onion for me, one onion for you. There was a standardized onion bundle, right? Onion bundle. So we'll say the problem with what the sharecropper did is, what did he do? He took a handful. So we'll say, what's a handful? A handful is a subjective amount. Subjective amounts, who gave you the rishus to do that, right? Or everything is jointly owned between you and the balabas. You can't just take a bundle and go ahead and give it away. Now, you can't take a handful and just give it away. Had he given a bundle is an objective unit. So then the sharecropper could have said, okay, I took one of my bundles. You'll get your bundle, I get my bundle. That would have been an effective Kiddushin. Fascinating. Hahu sarsei, the Kaddish Bepruma de Shichra. This is very interesting. There was a sarsei. What's a sarsei? Rashi says over here, Osa Shechar Tamarim, a brewer. I want to understand beer in the times of the Gemara was date beer. So there was a brewer. Now what was the chap with the brewer? Rashi says, Osa schar mitmarim shabal abayis lemachzis schar. So the way it would work is a brewer you'd have a brewer, somebody would come to him with dates, right? And he would make the beer from the dates of the balabayis. Then what they would do is they would split up the proceeds afterwards. That's the way it would work. So what happened? There was a brewer who was mekadesh with the date dregs. Like, I guess, in other words, after you go ahead and you make the beer, I don't know if dregs is the right word. I don't think dregs is the right word, because dregs is like what you have in the wine. But like, after you go ahead and you brew the beer from the dates, the leftover dates, the shirayim, the date shirayim. Now, I understand date shirayim still has a value. Why does it have a value? you could make multiple batches of beer. Now, obviously, it must be that they diminish like in quality and strength, but Lamaisa, every batch of dates could be used and reused. So what happens is he made a batch of beer, and then he was mekadesh the woman. It was mekadesh the woman with the dates, with the leftover dates. So what happened? Asam arei de shechra. So the owner of the beer, the owner of the dates came along and said, Ashkechei, found what he did. Amarlei, amaylo tesev mahei charifa. You should have given her better dates. So that's what the owner of the dates says. So both say, when you take that statement, what does it sound like? Now remember, the dates did not belong to the brewer. The dates belong to the balabayas. Nevertheless, the brewer used the dates to go ahead for Kesef Kiddushin. The brewer finds out about this. He says, oh, you should have used better dates. You should have taken even superior dates. Now it sounds like that the owner of the dates was totally okay with this. Was mochel. They came of Rava. Amar lo amru kelecha eitzel yafos el le'in shuma. Bilvad. Rabbi said this idea that you should have used something more beautiful only applies to truma, doesn't apply to anything else. What does it mean? This time, listen to this. Keitzad amru torim shalom idaito truma sa truma. Rabbi said, listen to this. There are cases where you could separate out truma on behalf of someone else, and ultimately, again, it is an effective truma. What's the case over there? For example, Hare shiyar l'soch sadei chavero. Listen to this. Ruvain goes into Shimon's field. V'likeit v'taram. He harvests Shimon's field and he separates out truma. Shelo b'rishos, without Shimon's rishos. Im choshesh mishum gezel. Ain't truma sa truma. Let's say if there's a possibility of theft. In other words, if we think that maybe Shimon views this act of theft and the truma is not a good truma, im lav truma sa truma. If not, the truma is a good truma. I will say, how do you know? So we'll say, so now just understand what's happened over here. Reuven's gone to Shimon's field, harvested Shimon's produce, his crop, and separate out truma. So the Gemara says, so is it an effective separation or not? It depends. If Shimon is choshesh because of gezel, of theft, then the truma designation is not good. If he's not choshesh because of theft, then ultimately the truma designation is good. What's the shayla? How do you know what Shimon's opinion of this is? Watch this. So the Gemara says, Hari sheba balabayis umasa. Shimon comes home. He sees that Reuven has harvested his field and Reuven has separated out truma. Va'amarlo keilecha eitzel yafos. And he says, Reuven, you should have even separated out nicer truma from the produce. Shabbos say, im nimtzu yafos mehem trumasa truma. If it indeed Shimon has nicer produce, then that shows that Shimon is happy with what Reuven did, and the truma designation stands. Ve'im lav, but if Reuven doesn't have nicer truma, then what Rabbi say? Ein truma so truma. Then ultimately, again, the truma designation is not a valid one. Rabbi say, and then how do we view a statement? It's viewed as a sarcastic one, right? Oh, you should have separated out even nicer stuff. In other words, big tzaddik separating out my truma, you should have even separated out nicer stuff. So Rabbi say, if he has nicer stuff, then ultimately, again, that's viewed as consent to what Reuven did. If Shimon doesn't have nicer stuff, nicer produce, it's viewed as a statement of sarcasm. I will say ultimately again, if after coming home and seeing what Reuven did, Shimon adds on more truma, then ultimately again what Reuven did is a valid designation. So let's go back for just a second. So now what happened? Remember, let's go back to the brewer. So the brewer took dates that did not belong to him, used them for Kiddushin. The owner comes back and he says, oh, you should have used even nicer dates. So now remember again, Rava said this idea that quote unquote you should have used something nicer as a demonstration of acquiescence of the owner only applies to truma, doesn't apply to other things. I say, how do we understand the owner's statement over here? Aval hacha mishum kisufahu da'avid ve'ena mikadesh. And everybody's saying sometimes a person is embarrassed to go ahead and state their true feelings, so they use sarcasm as a tool to kind of express what it is. So what happens? We're saying, in this case over here, you see, remember in the truma case, Shimon has to separate out truma regardless. So there's the possibility that he's totally fine with what Reuven did, right? Because Lamaisa, he's going to have to separate out anyway. Again, so the shaila is he happy? Is he not happy? He says you should have separated out nicer produce. Okay, if he has nicer produce, that shows that he is happy. He doesn't have nicer produce, it shows that he's unhappy. But there's a possibility to say that he's okay with what Reuven did. I will say, in this case of the beer, of the brewer, so the order of the day essentially is like, what's the matter with you? That's not yours. It's not yours. You can't use something that's not yours to affect Kiddushin. So the way we interpret this statement of you should have used nicer dates is pure, unadulterated sarcasm. Sarcasm. He just is embarrassed to say, what's the matter with you? Why are you taking stuff that doesn't belong to you? Say, frames it as a form of sarcasm, which Rabbi says actually, it's also, again, you can learn everything you need to be successful in life from Gemara. Which Rabbi says, sometimes, again, it's also helpful to know when people are sarcastic, sarcasm is often a way that people communicate a sense of hurt, right? So some people could communicate directly, I'm feeling hurt. Other people use sarcasm as a tool to communicate that really they're feeling. So again, the Gemara says over here, when the owner of dates comes back, he's like, oh, you should have used nicer dates, which means, what the heck is wrong with you? You're using stuff that doesn't belong to you to affect Kiddushin. That's not right. That's not right. But he's too embarrassed to say it straight out, so he frames it in the form of sarcasm. Okay, both say beautiful. Mishnah, here we go. This is a great case. Hamakavish bechelko bein kachei kadashim me kachim kalim inu kadosh. Both say, by the way, so this is a incredible case. Kohen, for the Kohanim, this is very shayach. So both say, so Kohanim, a Kohen wants to be a Kaddish a woman. Kohen has a great idea. I'm going to take a piece of sacrificial meat, and I'm going to use that for Kiddushin. I'm going to Kaddish Isha with a nice steak, and not any steak, I will say, not any steak, carbonic steak. Right? I'm going to take carbonic steak. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, this is such a shaykh case, I will say, because you can imagine, it's also so beautiful learning it's now Chalamayid. As I mentioned, remember again, this was a time there were so many karbanos happening in the Beis HaMikdash during this time of year, because remember again, since everyone is Ola Regel, this is when they're fulfilling all of their other obligations. So Chatas and Asham, Toda, anything and everything you had to bring. Remember again, you were living in Tel Aviv, you were living in the Galil. You had to bring a carbon. You weren't just dropping everything to go bring a carbon, because like I said, it's a long trip. You already knew that 3 times a year you have to go. So bepashtos you would wait, and it's okay. Halachically, you're allowed to wait until the next Yom Tiv. You'll take all of your karbanos with you, or buy your karbanos in Yerushalayim. Probably a better idea. Right? So now, the Kohanim, I will say, during the Yomim Tovim, Baruch Hashem, have plenty of meat. And remember again, I will say, during the Yomim Tovim, everyone serves. Right? Although they were normally mishmaros, right? They were Kohanic watches on the Yomim Tovim, every Kohen is present, which means that Baruch Hashem, for the Kohanim, Yom Tov was beautiful. Plenty of meat, plenty of wine. So now you have a Kohen who has a great idea. Me and this girl, we've been seeing each other for a while. I think finally, again, I was always worried about my bank account. Now, I'm flush with carbonic meat, right? So Lamaisa, let me use some of it for Kiddushin. So now, so Kaddish woman, Bein Bekachim Kal, Bein Bekachim Kedashim, Eimim Mekudeshes. All right, the bad news is, although it sounds like such a beautiful idea, it does not work. Doesn't work. You can't be Mekadesh a woman. Ultimately, again, yeah, okay, David Khan is telling me that Tel Aviv is only 100 plus years old. Yeah, Makabal, just for illustrative purposes. Right? So the Gemara says as follows. So what happens? Ein Mekudeshes. B'meiser Sheni, what happens if, so now that's a Kohen. What happens now? Yisrael wants to Meiser Sheni. Remember again, Meiser Sheni is yours, right? Yours, but you have to eat it in Yerushalayim. So a man wants to Meiser Sheni. Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid. Again, we'll discuss what that means. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, lo kiddush. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. Direi Meir. So also Meir says, essentially, Meir holds you can't be Mekadesh a woman with Meiser Sheni. We're going to see, by the way, what's happening over here is as follows. The common denominator here is going to be Meir. Kachi Kadoshim, Kachim Kalim, Meiser Sheni, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the Ribono Shalom. So it's what's called your Ochlin Mishulchan Gavoa. You're able to eat from the high table. The high table is the Ribono Shalom's table. So these items belong to Hashem. Again, I have the ability to eat from it. If I'm a Kohen, I can eat from it. Yisrael can eat his Meiser Sheni. But the Meiser, it doesn't belong to me. So because it doesn't belong to me, I cannot create transactional realities with them, and therefore Allah Chalamayis can't be used for Kiddush. Rabbi Yehuda says, B'shogeg lo Kiddush, b'mezid Kiddush. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you use Meiser Sheni, B'shogeg, it doesn't work. B'mezid, it does work. So we'll see exactly what that means in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Ubehekdish, if you used hekdish, b'mezid kiddush. If you use hekdish b'mezid, it does work. Ubeshogeg lo kiddush shevrei meir. Meir says again, hekdish b'mezid works. B'shogeg doesn't work. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Hudar b'shogeg kiddush b'mezid lo kiddush. The Gemara will say, we'll see exactly what that machlokes is all about. Says the Gemara. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yosef Galili. Why? What does Rabbi Yosef Galili say? The Sanya uma'ala ma'al ba'ashem l'rabos kachim kalim shin mamon of Rabbi Yosef Galili. What Rabbi Yosef Galili holds that kachim kalim. Remember, we'll say different forms of karbanos. Kachim kadoshim, kachim kalim. Rabbi Yosef holds that kachim kalim ultimately again belong to the owners. They are the mamon, right? They are the mamon ultimately again of the owner. The Rabbi Yosef Galili. So we'll say the Gemara is suggesting our Mishnah clearly does not reflect that view. Because what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said that if you try to be mekadesh woman with your piece of sacrificial meat from kachim kadashim or from kachim kalim, it doesn't work. Which shows you that what? It's not the mammon, it's not the financial property of the Kohen. And yet Rabbi Yosef Galili says, at least by kachim kalim, it is. To which the Gemara says, no. Rabbi Yosef Galili, ki kam Rabbi Yosef Galili mechayim aval achar shchita lo. Oh, let's see. Here we go. Rabbi Yosef Galili says that kachim kalim, lower sanctity karbanos, so to speak, are the property of the owner. Rabbi Yosef say, when is that? That's when the animal is alive. So the animal is alive, even though it's been consecrated, that animal is still the property of the owner. Again, it has financial repercussions. Rashi points out over here, it has to do ultimately with the carbon shvuah, which we're not going to get into right now. Right? But lamaisa, again, everyone agrees that once the animal is shechted, then it becomes the property of the Ribono Shel Olam. My time, what's the reason? I'll say here it is. Ki kazachu mishulchan gavoa kazach. I'll say so beautiful, because karbanos, Rabbi say, belong to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's just that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives the Kohanim a portion from his table. So I will say this is incredible. So the meat, right? Or by the way, it's not just the meat. There's also, remember again, there's other things. All of those things ultimately again belong to the Ribono Shel Olam. And ultimately the Kohanim are given a portion. Rashi says, Mishulchan Gavoa, Hakravas Imurim, Uzrikas Hadam, Matir Habasar. So we'll say it's only after the sacrificial parts and the sprinkling of the blood that's done that the meat becomes permitted for consumption. But even once it becomes permitted for consumption, Rabbi say, who does it belong to? The Ribono Shel Olam. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Dekanami Diktani. Ultimately, you can see this is true. Diktani, Hamekadish Bechelko, Bein Kachek Hadashim, Bein Kachim Kalim, Lo Kadish Shmamin. I will say you can see this explicitly, right? What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says if you try to betroth the woman with, again, it's talking about Kohanim, you try to go out and consecrate the woman with the sacrificial meat of Kachek Hadashim or Kachim Kalim, ultimately, again, it does not work. I will say, why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because halacha l'maisa, it's not yours. You are consuming it mi'al shulchan gavah. I will say, we'll stop over here for today. Incredible, dramatic story. I want to start tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to start with an incredible story. I will say, such a schos. Baruch Hashem, shkayach everyone, a good night. And we'll say, how incredible is it that every single day of Chalamayit so far, there's been an Eretz Yisrael Gemara. How absolutely incredible is that? That is not by accident, right? You could go weeks, not months. You could go weeks without an Eretz Yisrael Gemara. And I will say here we are Zoch every day of Chalamayit. If we can't be in Yerushalayim, we can't be in Eretz Yisrael, at least we get to learn Torah here. So I will say shkoyach and a good night. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day, everyone. A good night.
I just want to say I was the one who shouted.